Good evening, everyone. My name is Laurence Gautier. I'm a historian based in New Delhi at the French Research Center, the Centre de Sciences Humaines, the Center for Social Sciences and Humanities. And it's my great pleasure this evening to be in conversation with Audrey Truschke, who doesn't really require an introduction, but I'll still introduce her very briefly. So as you probably know, Audrey is professor of history at Rutgers University in the US, where she teaches South Asian history and religions. She's, of course, a very well-established historian whose research work focuses primarily on the Mughal period with a focus on inter-community relations. Her first book was entitled Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and it was published in 2016. 1 year later, she published a book that drew a lot of attention, so on Aurangzeb. You've probably heard of this book. And in 2021, she published a new book entitled The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Rule. And she's now about to publish yet another book, which is even more ambitious than the previous ones, which is, I don't know if that's the official title, but at least the version that I read, okay, so is Indianama, A History of the Subcontinent and South Asia, which is a very daring move in the sense that it offers in one volume a concise history of the entire subcontinent, so primarily India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, but also includes, to some extent, other South Asian countries, i.e. Nepal, Bhutan, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka. I will, if you do not mind, I will, of course, she's the main speaker, so I will let her speak. But before we do that, I'll just introduce some of the, what I consider to be some of the characteristic features of the book that will allow us to address the question that we raised today, which is what are the new ways of writing history? New ways of writing history, first, it raises the question of the form, the format of the book itself, which is eminently readable, and that has many implications. I will come to this in a minute. And the second, I think, major novelty in the book is, of course, in its content, the importance that she gives to a diversity of voices to present a history of the subcontinent that is as comprehensive and inclusive as possible in just one volume. So again, that's a major challenge. So just to go back to my first point on the format of the book itself, as I said, it's eminently readable. What does it mean concretely? So it's a book that is addressed primarily, as you say in the introduction, to undergraduate students. And of course here, I'm sure that your experience as a teacher was critical to how you compose this book, but also to a larger audience. This is reflected in the format, so you have 25 short chapters, and you make it clear from the beginning that you will avoid jargon and what you call guild talk, which I quite like that term. That is terms that only specialists understand. Each chapter ends with a short paragraph on your main references, main historians whose work you're using, which is of course a very useful tool for students and teachers. You also include box quotes, so again, which can be used in class, but it also shows the importance that you give to primary sources, and maybe that's a point you will want to come back to. And as a result, this makes for a great reference book for students, teachers, or anyone interested in South Asian history. But I think beyond this utilitarian approach, I think, to me, this emphasis on readability seems to reflect a deeper urge to make scholarly history writing accessible to a large audience. And I think this is not just, I think this is a question that is actually political. How to make scholarly history writing accessible to a large audience is particularly important at a time when you have, a wide range of people who are writing history, who are not necessarily trained as historians and who are offering, narratives that are not necessarily always based on accurate facts. I have other examples in mind of well-established historians of South Asia who, in the recent past, have also published synthetic histories that are meant specifically for a large audience. So in India, of course, Romila Thapar is one major historian who's also considered to be a major public intellectual. I'm also thinking of Richard Eaton, whose work on India in the Persianate age can also be considered as one such example of synthetic history addressed to a large audience. My own supervisor, Joya Chatterjee, published recently Shadows at Noon, which is a history of colonial and post-colonial South Asia, in which she also weaves in personal anecdotes to make the book even more readable. So all of this to say that questions of format are actually deeply political too, in a way, in the sense that it's important to make this history accessible to a large audience. So my question for you here is, what prompted you to write a history of the entire subcontinent at this point of time? And second, why in this format in particular? For example, why one volume instead of, a range of volumes as you could have done? Yeah, that's my first question for you.
So, can everyone hear me? Wonderful. So thank you very much for that kind introduction and the questions. It's great to be here and in conversation. And thank you to you all for coming out to talk and listen and think with me about writing history and what it looks like. So let me start with answering this question of why I decided to do this by saying that it wasn't my idea. Okay, every other, well, that's not true. So most of my other books, 2 of them have been my idea. The Aurangzeb book was also not my idea. That was somebody else's idea. But anyways, and in this case, a publisher approached me from Princeton University Press. And Princeton University Press has this, they do this a lot, these like overarching, sweeping histories. And they said, we need one for India. Will you write it? And I said no, because it's insane. It's completely ludicrous to try to write almost 5,000 years of history for a quarter of the world's population in one book. I was like, you're out of your mind. Absolutely not. And then this publisher, who obviously has figured out what makes me tick, she said, well, Audrey, I get it. I understand, it's fine. Just so you know, we have a hard time getting women to write these histories. It's mainly men. And so I was like, all right, sign me up. So that's how I came to write it. I was looking to write a book that aimed at a popular audience more. My first book was for academics, second book was for popular audience. So the third book went back to academics, so I was looking to pull that same trick again and circle back to a more popular audience. In terms of the book's format, so I think there's a couple of things to know. One is that it really does cover everything, like the whole shebang. Like I start with prehistory. There's not that much on prehistory. So really with a hardcore on the Indus Valley civilization, so 2600 BCE. And then I end in 2023 because that's when I finished writing it. I do not short shrift pre-modernity. Okay, and that's another important thing. There have been many a book that has been written that promises to be an overarching history either of India or South Asia. And the first 50 pages go to about 1757. Right, not about, really exactly 1757. And then it's with the Battle of Plassey that things get serious, and that's the next 400 pages. And I do not do that, okay? A solid 2/3 of the book is before the British get there, okay? And then the last third, I think 6 of those chapters are within what most people would term the British period. I do not, I'll come back to that. And then only 2 are about post-independence. Okay, so out of 25 chapters, the vast majority, 17, 18, are pre-British, and that's a deliberate choice. I think it's more honest to the history, and it also I think just makes my book stand out. Right, anytime you write a general overview history, there's a question: why do we need this? Right? People have written these before. What's new? What's different? And that's one thing that's different. And especially thinking about it from a classroom context, it's very hard for people like me who want to teach a lot about pre-modernity when we have textbooks that cover pre-modernity and what would be 1 or 2 class sessions, right? So then you're sort of supplementing and adding in. And so I really am envisioning a different way of teaching South Asian history that gives a lot of time to the pre-modern and the early modern. As Laurence said, I also avoid jargon in the book. So this is everything from Persianate and Islamicate, where we add ATE to words because we're academics and it's fun to make them longer. With very few exceptions, I do not use those terms. I know we have good academic reasons for doing so, but newsflash, no one knows what those words mean outside of the academy. Nobody, okay? I also try to avoid words when I was working on prehistory, especially Neolithic and Paleolithic, right? So, like, I'm sure all historians of prehistory in South Asia know when the Neolithic was in different regions, but nobody else does, right? Just give dates, it's much easier. So I really do try to make it accessible. The chapters are also relatively short. Okay, the chapters are between 6,000 and 7,000 words max. I do not go over 7,000 words in any single chapter. If you're used to reading academic books, 10 to 12,000 words is a more normal chapter length. So, you know, to me, maybe other people have more focused students, but in the smartphone age, none of my students will actually read 12,000 words, right? If you think your students are reading that, I don't know, maybe they're better, maybe you're fooling yourself, I don't know. But anyway, so I really wanted something just more readable and appropriate to our times. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I came to write it and kind of the general format and structure.
So I just wanted to go back to now the second question, which is more regarding content. So you've already hinted at some of it, saying that your focus is very much on pre-modernity, but I think one characteristic feature of the book is really your focus, as you say in the introduction, your focus on people rather than states or dynasties. They of course appear in the book, but they are not your main focus. And of course you make space for a very wide range of voices that reflect the diversity of the subcontinent's rich history. So what do I mean by diversity of voices? So first it means literally, well, the language, and of course you pay it. Given your earlier work, you know, which already looks at Sanskrit and Persian in the Mughal court, or, you know, how, for example, Sanskrit was used under Indo-Muslim rule, it's not surprising that you would pay such attention to language, but beyond Sanskrit and Persian, you also have other vernacular languages that you refer to. And so that's one important aspect of this diversity that you're highlighting. The other one is the fact that you pay attention to different parts of the subcontinent. So again, going against the usual focus on North India, you try to also bring in a lot more of Southern India. You also, you know, refer to other South Asian countries, as I said earlier. So Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives also appear in the book, even if to a lesser extent as compared to what are today India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And by the way, it allows me to make to just briefly make one quick point on India. You insist in the introduction on the fact that what we mean by India for a very, you know, for the longest time was actually referring to the entire subcontinent, right? So by saying India, you're not just talking about post-1947 India. And finally, by diversity, I mean diversity of actors of history, including those who've long been marginalized in the grand historical narrative. So women, locals, Dalits, Adivasis are also prominent actors here. And I quite like how you bring them in. For example, you know, you will use specific examples to show how they meant different things for different types of actors. Just to give you one quick example, in your last chapter on post-independence, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you show how dams for Nehru were like new temples of India, but for the Adivasi poet Jacinta Kerkata, it invoked the experience of farmers' displacement. Now, that's a very concrete example of how, you know, the same thing had very different implications for different kinds of actors, and we need to pay attention to that. You also take the time, even though it's a concise history, quite obviously it's in one volume you have to tell the history of the entire subcontinent, but you still take the time to develop longer examples, which I really enjoyed, including, for example, in your chapter on the Delhi Sultanate, you speak of Queen Razia, who was one of the few female rulers of pre-modern India, and you show how she bended gender-based rules of seclusion to become a more efficient ruler and to become a more efficient military leader. So these are examples of that are really crucial to recognize the agency of sections of the population who are otherwise often considered to be marginal actors or simply passive, passive actors really who are, are just part of the masses of people. So you give a voice to them, even as you recognize the power balance and the hierarchies that they had to negotiate with. So, to come to my question, and you partly answered this question, but still, so you aim at writing a comprehensive history, comprehensive both in terms of time, in terms of actors, and at the same time, this is a one-volume history of the entire subcontinent. So, of course, I'm sure that you had to take harsh decisions as to what to include and what to leave out. So what were the main challenges that you faced, and what were the main guidelines that you followed, to take these critical decisions?
Yeah, so thank you so much. So that's a great question. I think, I don't know, is it, maybe I shouldn't use the word comprehensive, right? You just can't do comprehensive, and what will in the end be about 400 printed pages. The book will be about 600 pages with all the images and maps and all of that. I strive for, as you say, representation on various levels. And I think of this by contrast. So for example, if you read a lot of books on the colonial period, there's a lot of Bengal. Okay, Bengal appears a lot. And yes, Bengal was very important in the colonial period, but so were other parts of India. And so I try to not have over-representation. When I was writing the book, there came certain points where I was like, oh, I haven't mentioned, one that comes to my mind is, I was in like the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, and I hadn't mentioned Northeast India at all yet, right? And so I worked in a little bit on Assam. And this is not a perfect solution, right? It's not like it's okay to just, have 3 pages on one region at one particular point in history and, oh, we call it a day, right? But I think it's at least better than only focusing on Bengal and Delhi. And if we have anything from the south, it's from the cities, right? It's, from Madras or something like that. So I do go for regional diversity. I would say one point I want to make is that throughout the book, I do prioritize voices of Indians, right? And again, just to highlight, I do use India in its historical sense, which means the subcontinent, okay? So what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan are considered India until 1947. And I explain in the introduction, this is a historian's privilege. I see no reason why the modern nation state should be a means. Anyways. But I do prioritize Indian voices throughout. And again, that's, in a sense, it sounds like a very banal point. You're writing Indian history. Of course it is about Indian people, but actually that's not often the case. And again, I think this is most easily seen when one gets to the colonial period. Like often when you're reading a general overview history, it's all Indian names, and then you get to colonialism, and suddenly it's not, right? It's all Jones and Hallhead and right, all these British names. And yes, these people were important, but to me, there's 2 ways of writing the history of British colonialism in South Asia. One is as part of British history, and it should be written that way, and I leave that to British historians to figure out, right? But I write it as part of South Asian history, and so even throughout the colonial period, I do prioritize Indian voices and Indian perspectives, some of which were pro-colonialism, right? That's part of the history as well. And so again, going back to the kind of seeing different viewpoints on sort of different parts. I think in terms of what to cut from the book, this was hard. So going into every chapter, I had a list of topics that I thought I should probably mention. And this is drawn from my own knowledge, from wide reading, from how I teach it, right, this sort of thing. I would then read a bunch of books and articles on this general period. This would then add to the list of things that I should think that I should cover, and I generally covered a third or less of what was on that must-cover list. Honestly, I think that I think readers will miss less for pre-modernity, okay? And that's just because people's knowledge is less, right? So, I don't know if I mentioned the Pratihara dynasty. And I don't know if anyone's going to notice that I don't mention that at all. I'm sure some Sanskritists will call me up, but that's fine, right? On the other hand, when we come to modernity, especially what is within living memory, right? People know a lot. And so there's things that I cut from especially the last chapter that I remain deeply uncomfortable with. And as Laurence knows, I have an afterword where I actually have a list of, and I say I could have covered, and then I have like 5 lines, just this like list of things I could have covered in the end chapter of the book, and I didn't. And it's basically a form of cover, right? Like the last chapter of the book focuses on sort of everyday life, climate change, things like that. And as a result, I don't talk about political history from the 90s onwards for the most part. And this means that, you know, for example, I don't mention when Pakistan went nuclear, right? It seems an important thing to mention at some point, but it just doesn't quite make it in there. And so if I have a defense of some of my more questionable decisions in the book, and I say something like this in the introduction, it is as follows. That my book should not be the first and last book that anybody should ever read about South Asian history, right? There can never and should never be such a book. And again, to the extent I think my decisions that will strike people as most questionable concern modern politics, and my decision to not cover a number of more intricate political developments of the last 30 years. And for readers who are upset by that, I would simply say you have a lot of options to choose from. Many people have written about that, right? And so I felt that to sort of recover that at great length, which would have meant cutting more stuff from pre-modernity and cultural history, that would not have added much to the conversation. So.
Okay, before we open the floor to question, I have one more point and question. So, in your introduction, you insist on your credentials as a trained historian, which, you know, it's interesting because you're already very well-established historians, but it's interesting that, so you insist on the fact that, you know, on your credentials, basically, committed to academic rigor, and you highlight also the importance of facts. You even dare use the term positivist, which is often considered to be a dirty word. Now, and you also make a distinction between your way of writing history as a trained historian and non-academic ways of remembering the past. Now, my question to you is, why is it at all important to highlight this? Shouldn't it be obvious? And of course, this is partly a rhetorical question, but I want to hear you on this. And I have a correlated question, which is, what is your take on the current trajectory of the idea of decolonizing history? Why am I bringing in this point here? It's because post-colonial and decolonial studies have really encouraged us to reflect on the structural biases of history writing as a discipline, which developed in the 19th century in the context of high imperialism and nationalism. And so these studies have questioned the fact that, and you know, many serious historians have raised the point that we need to challenge these biases that are so strongly embedded in our discipline, and that includes the centrality of the nation state, but also of written archives, and also even the linear conception of time, for example. And so, you know, these post-colonial and decolonial studies have, you know, tried to think of other ways of writing history that can account for a more diverse way of looking at the past, right? And I think that this has had a positive impact, you know, this reflection. However, now what we are seeing is that the idea of decolonizing history is being used to discard academic history writing to promote a more majoritarian narrative. We have recent examples in India, for example, with books such as Said Dipak's book, India as Bharat, sorry. And what is interesting is that in his foreword, you have prominent intellectuals who are associated with decolonial studies who have, you know, written a praise of the book. And here I just want to briefly quote Walter Mignolo, who's a well-known figure of decolonial studies, who says, so he praises how Said Dipak reconstitutes ways of knowing and patterns of sensing that were destituted and continue to be so in the name of progress, democracy, and economic development. So I wonder to what extent your point on the emphasis that you place on writing a more positivist form of history, which emphasizes facts, and how you I mean, the kind of history that you write is different from other non-academic ways of remembering the past. I wonder to what extent this speaks to this kind of debate on decolonizing history.
Absolutely. So there's a lot there. So, okay, let me talk about sort of professional qualifications first and why they matter, and then I'll come to the decolonialization point. So I talk about in the introduction sort of who I am and why I'm writing a history book, and why you as a reader might care about what I have to say. And so it's in that context that I talk about sort of being a trained historian and degrees and reading pre-modern and modern languages and things of that nature. And I'm doing this in sort of two major contexts. One is we have a fairly large class of non-professional historians, popular historians in India who write a lot of books and sell very well, and essentially, with very few exceptions, nearly all of which fall very short of any kind of understanding of historical causality. Okay? I'm also writing about qualifications in the context of the United States, where we are facing a pretty massive and growing pushback against the academy and the humanities overall, and just a devaluing of our expertise right now. So I felt it important to state what maybe 20 years ago might have been obvious, which is that it actually takes training to write history. And I talk about why, that, knowing certain languages, I can read Persian and Sanskrit and Braj Pasha and modern Hindi and Urdu to a lesser degree, that this gives me access to a wide range of sources, even while it's not enough, right? My lack of knowledge of any Dravidian languages is a notable omission for me. I also talk about a little bit about the understanding of sort of, on the one hand, there are facts, right? And in this sense, I'm very old school. Like, there are things that are true about our world and about the past especially, right? And, you can word them in different ways, but you can't change the facts, right? And we have to recognize that. But on the other hand, a list of sort of names and dates, or dates and events, that's a timeline. History is all the words between that string those things together. And to do that well, you have to have a sense of historical causality and think about different kinds of trends and how we might explain things, right? Can we talk about one powerful leader in the past, like Aurangzeb Alamgir, and say that he made this huge difference? Or was it really perhaps larger forces having to do with the nature of the Mughal state and who was owning land and tax collection and the extension of the Mansabdari system and all of these things that he actually had a somewhat marginal role in, right? He was part of that larger system. He neither made nor broke it. And that example can be extended to sort of every point in history. And so I think that it's only with a lot of training that one is able to sort of see a bigger picture, and yet then present that in a way that people can grasp and make sense, right? And I would point out here that my argument is not that I'm always correct, okay? Obviously, I think that I'm right. If I think I'm wrong, I change how I tell a story, okay? And I did change my mind on numerous issues in the course of writing this book. But it's rather that I make a sound historical argument. Whereas often we see popular historians who do not even make good faith arguments, much less anything that approaches sound history. And so this brings me to the decolonization point. Decolonization in terms of intellectual thought was a great idea. And it's gone incredibly south in its implementation in recent years, I would say. So I'm pro-decolonization in the sense of finding more diverse voices in, for me, the South Asian past. Different ways of seeing, different ways of talking about the past. All of that is great. But I think that language, as we've seen, can very easily be co-opted from a far right-wing perspective in order to essentially colonize again. Right, and we see these sort of Hindu nationalist writers in India, and they seem to think that the problem with colonization in India was that it was led by the British, and that wasn't the problem. Right? It was that it had to do with the enforcement of foreign ideas on Indian soil and the sort of not taking into account what the vast majority of Indians, what their experience was, and not letting them have a say in government and things like that. And we're seeing a similar devaluation of rights right now in India. And to the extent that the language of decolonization can intellectually help that project, I think it is a quite terrible thing. And on that note, I'll just say that so my book, one criticism that I expect of it is that it's light on theory, okay? And it's there, but it's hidden in the background, right? I don't talk a lot about theory. I mentioned in the introduction why, which is that I think for me, when one is doing sort of hard history stuff, right? Like I am in this book, stuff that actually happened in the past. This is not an intellectual thought piece or something like that. This is like stuff that actually occurred. Theory is only useful insofar as it helps you understand past events. At the moment at which theory becomes theory in itself and no longer helps me understand the past, in this project, it became irrelevant. Okay, that's not always the case. Sometimes I do, you know, more thought stuff, but in this instance, that's sort of how it went down. And so, especially in reading, I read a huge variety of historians, obviously, to write this book, and for many, the theory chokes their understanding of the past. And I think many of my colleagues who have written these books would disagree with that, but that's sort of how I came to see it. And so I do have a sort of utilitarian approach to theory, including decolonization.
Thank you. I think it's time to open the floor to questions. So who would like to ask a question about the side of new ways of writing history? Yes, please.
Was Kosambi. You talk about theory. So how do you, what's your perspective on that? His approach to a study of Indian history?
So, I mean, Kosambi was a great historian, you know, I mean, India has produced so many great historians, right? You know, Lawrence also mentioned Ramila Topper, who has written an excellent history of India, whose only flaw is that it only goes to 1300, right? I mean, if she had just gone all the way, maybe I wouldn't have written this book. But anyways, I mean, I think that Kosambi was great, and I mean, especially on sort of land stuff and, you know, who's owning what and what that looks like, excellent work. I mean, Kosambi, as far as I know, never wrote an overarching history, right? And I think one thing that distinguishes my book from the work of him and many other people, I mean, he had sort of one major approach and was interested in this particular kind of social history. Whereas in this book, for me, I'm sort of a gadfly in that I jump around, right? So I have chapters that are cultural history. I have other chapters that focus on religious history. Some are social history, political history, right? I don't choose one lens through which to understand the Indian past. But I would never denigrate the work of people who take a more specialist approach, as indeed I have in other works.
Hi. My reference point to Indian history before the Mughal period, or before the Muslim period, is Ramila Thappar's Penguin history. What will I find different in your book about that period?
Okay, sorry? Let me answer this one, and then we can do. Okay, so the question is, what will a reader find different between my book versus Ramila Topper's early India book that goes to about 1300 CE? So the chapters are shorter, the sentences are more readable. Okay, Ramila Topper is an excellent historian. My students find her difficult to read. All right. I include box quotes from primary sources in every single chapter. Right, Ramila Topper does excellent primary source research, but she does not include a great number of lengthy quotes. There's some in her book, but not a huge number. Whereas for me, that's a sizable chunk of every single chapter, is letting people from the Indian past speak for themselves. Obviously, always in translation. She focuses very much on dynasties in her book, right? Everything's sort of following dynasties, especially in northern India. Right, I mean, we have the Cholas appearing from the south, but otherwise not much there. And so for that, there's sort of two major differences with my book. One is that I really try to get away from the emphasis on dynasties. And for pre-modern history, I think this will strike readers the most for what most people think of as the Gupta period, okay? I have a chapter that deals with South Asia, 300 to 700 CE. The Guptas come up, I think 5/6 of the way through that chapter, all right? And it's for like 2 paragraphs, and that's it. That's all there is on the Guptas. because I honestly don't think that they were all that important or central, right? They became more important and central in imagination far later on, right? But in terms of changing the actual course of history, I disagree with many of my colleagues on how central the Guptas are. And that sort of thing, I mean, the Guptas are perhaps the most poignant example, but I also just skip over entirely a lot of dynasties that Professor Topper covers at great length. And I have a number of reasons for this. Part of it is that we have her book, so if you want the great history, the great dynasties approach, like reread her book, that's fine, I don't need to improve on that. Part of it is that I think it is limiting, right? Because then you are always telling the history of India through a political lens, right? And you always forefront the politics, and then anything that happens socially or culturally comes later, right? This also causes one to miss things. Okay, so for example, to go back to my chapter 300 to 700 CE, the major primary source that I excerpt in that chapter is from the Charter of Vishnusena in 592 CE, okay, which is something that I don't even know if Professor Topper mentions it in her book. I don't think she does. I've never seen another historian cover this in an overview sort of history book. And this is a charter, it's from Western India, sort of along the Gujarat coastline. It's written and used within a merchant community. Okay, and there's a set of 70 some kind of like, not really laws, but kind of precepts, things we're going to follow as a merchant community. And in the translated excerpt, I give the first 10. And this allows me to talk about merchant communities and their sort of internal kind of legal structures and how they govern themselves. And there's not really a relevant dynasty. Like, it's within the Maitrika dynasty, but that's not like particularly relevant in any way. And most people have never heard of that dynasty anyways. So not having a strong political emphasis allows me to bring that in. The last thing that I'll mention is the North India focus. So I must admit, I am a recovering North India hegemon, okay? And this is very hard for me, you know, because of Persian and Hindi and Urdu being some of my languages. Sanskrit is less so, that's all over the place. But that combined with how Indian history has been written for so long, it's so much about the North, right? We just don't talk about the South nearly as much, right? Only at these particular points. And I really do try to reverse that. I try to reverse that from the very first chapter. So the first chapter is largely about the Indus civilization. That's obviously in the north. But I do have a little bit there where towards the end where I talk about other stuff going on. And I talk about the ash mounds in Karnataka, which many people have probably never heard of. But in the second to the first millennium BCE, there were groups in Karnataka who would pile up cow dung and set it on fire. And I'm not talking a little, I'm talking like a lot, okay? And the fires would burn at an excess of 1,300 degrees Celsius, so hot that it calcified into this like almost glassy substance. They did this over hundreds, in one case over 1,000 years, and the mounds are so large that they are still visible in the Karnataka landscape today. There are scholars who have done, archaeologists who have done excavations at the site, and drawing on their research, I was able to talk a little bit about what this might mean and why people might have put on what would have been fantastic fireworks displays, right? You would have seen that thing blazing from 20 miles around. It would have been incredible. And they did it again and again, and this was in their central habitation areas. It was obviously important to social life, maybe religious life, right? So I bring in stuff like that. The last example that I'll give, which may not be super well received, we'll see. So when we get to sort of Indo-Muslim rule, right? I do not begin this with Muhammad bin Qasim because that's really more of a local issue, sorry. But I do obviously cover Mahmud of Ghazni. Okay, Mahmud of Ghazni, a pretty important guy, raised Somnath, so on and so forth. Every other history book I've ever read, it sort of forefronts Mahmud, right? Like whatever the chapter is, we open with him. And I don't. I subsume him within a chapter on the Cholas, right? So the vast majority of the chapter is on the Cholas in South India. And then I have a North India interlude. And then I cover Mahmud of Ghazni. And it basically reverses the gaze, right? Many a historian of pre-modern India has covered North India, and then, oh, by the way, here's some stuff that went on in the South, right? You have the Southern interlude. And I reversed that.
Since you mentioned Mahmud Ghazni, and you mentioned
In past as present, Ramila Thakur's recent, well, not so recent, there's a wonderful chapter on the many histories of Somnath. What do you think of that chapter?
Yes, so Professor Tauber also published a whole book on Somnath, right? And I think that chapter draws on this, Somnath, the Many Lives, or something like this. And it's excellent work, right? It was not super relevant to this particular book project, and that is because in that work, Ramila Tauber is focused on this sort of historiographical approach and how Somnath was remembered in different communities and talked about throughout time. One decision that I made in the book is I overwhelmingly focus on what actually happened rather than the historiography thereof. Right? And I have a lot of reasons for that, one of which being it was an easy thing to cut, right? Talking about historiography takes a lot of time. So with Somnath, I do mention sort of how we know about it and the sources. That's an important point there, right? We have no Hindu sources on that event. It was not important enough to record, or we don't have, or they didn't survive.
But she does give Hindu sources.
Later, not from the moment, right? From the event, we have one Indian source.
She says contemporary records of Hindu Brahmin priests in the area make no mention of Somnath.
Correct. Yeah. So we have a Jain source by a Jain author. He's not talking about Somnath necessarily, but he's talking about Mahmud of Ghaznī's raids in the region.
Yes, my question was regarding that you have been a historian, you are a historian, you have researched this area thoroughly. So there is one thing that about humans that we tend to come together, band together in the face of common calamity. So Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, we face common calamity regarding climate crisis. Water is a serious issue here. So are you, can you please just tell me about your analysis from the past, that what do you see in future for us? Will the governments of these three countries band together for common cause, or will they not?
So that's a great question. I'm afraid I can't really answer it, however, right? So I can tell you a couple of things. When you talk about the governments of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, right, like those were all formed yesterday from a historian's perspective, right? It's very new. I mean, that we would even have this division at all. There were other divisions in the past, right? The subcontinent has never been ruled by any single power ever, right? The British came close, but only because they sort of fudged it with the princely states. So, I mean, maybe that's one thing just to point out is the newness of having nation states in South Asia. I would say, however, you know, historians, we don't predict the future, right? So I don't know what the future of South Asia holds. If it helps, I can say one major theme in the final chapter of my book that I end on is climate change. And I choose that for a number of reasons. It's sort of the moment, people are interested in it, but also it is faced by everyone in this region, right? On a government level and on an individual level. And so whether India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other countries, Nepal, Sri Lanka, so forth, whether they all want to get along or not, they are all having to face climate change. Climate change is a Muslim conspiracy? I see.
My question is about the colonization in India. Do you think that India is in the process of decolonizing its system? If yes, then what are the indicators? And what is the importance of decolonization in India and in Pakistan or in Bangladesh? What do you think about this?
Yeah, so let's take it. Yeah. That's fine.
When we teach medieval history, generally two major problems we face. First is the British or colonial construction of the past, that how the British wrote about the medieval history, particularly the Mughals, and it is very difficult to just minimize the influence of the colonial writers. And secondly, the communalization of history, which happened particularly in Pakistan, that the Hindu-Muslim question and how the history has been constructed by particularly the Pakistani historians have constructed the medieval past as a conflict between Hindus and Muslims. So how these two major questions you have tackled in your book?
Yeah, so okay, so these are great, if very different questions. So let me say, I sort of said this before, but so one decision I made in the book is not to cover historiography. That does very much extend and was in many ways directly inspired by thinking about what to do about Indo-Muslim history, right? And many other scholars, right? So I'll cite Cynthia Talbot and Catherine Asher's book, India Before Europe, that covers more or less the Indo-Muslim period. I mean, they forefront some of their chapters with this, right? Like the British wrote all this stuff, they divided India into Hindus and Muslims and said Muslims oppress Hindus and this is wrong. And then they go on to have their history. What I have found when I teach that in the United States is that most of my students were not aware of the colonial historiography going in, but having been exposed to it, that's what they remember, right? They remember the introduction. They remember, oh yeah, the Muslims were the bad guys. They oppressed the Hindus. It was all about religion. And they don't remember like the 35 pages of the chapter after the first paragraph. So I decided I'm not going to do that. I address historiography in the introduction, and I mentioned some of these issues there. But that's it, right? And so my argument is that the time has come to just tell a new history as opposed to continually rehashing the past. I don't think that that works forever, right? If you're going to major in history, if history is going to be your course of study, obviously you're going to need to confront this. But if you're taking one class on South Asian history or you're going to read one book on South Asian history, I don't know that we have to rehash how colonial era scholars messed it all up every single time. And I would point out here that their narrative is much more, it sells better than our narrative, right? It's because it's easy to remember. It's like, okay, there were good guys, there were bad guys, these are words I know Muslims, I know Hindus, fine, we're done. Whereas, if folks like us come in and we start talking about, no, okay, there were the Mughals and they had this multi-ethnic group ruling with them and there were Rajputs, like people are gone by this point. They've never heard any of these words. So I think that that's one thing that I do there. What was the other question? About India decolonizing, right? I mean, no, I think India is not decolonizing. India is like recolonizing, if anything. I mean, Hindu nationalism is like the most colonial thing anyone has ever seen. And I know it really upsets Hindu nationalists when I talk about this, but like, it is a European import with South Asian window dressing. Like that's what it is. It's fundamentally fascist. And this is something that's very well documented and I cover in the book as well, right? The early associations between Nazi Germany and Hindu nationalists, members of the RSS, and even more so with Mussolini's Italy, right? And things like this. And so I think, as long as Hindu nationalists are in charge, India is not decolonizing. If anything, we're going the other way.
Do we have, I have a follow-up question on what you asked. I just have to, because in the meantime you answer the other question, so maybe I'll take another question from the floor.
British India is not accurate, I think. So could you elaborate on that?
Say the partition is not?
The connotation of the India being British India during 18th and 19th century, you mentioned that this connotation is not as much accurate. I think you mentioned something of this sort while talking at the beginning. So if I heard it correctly, could you elaborate on that?
I mean, so I think, so I cover partition. I give an entire chapter, basically, to partition. And I go back about 20 years before and some of the events leading up. But I think there's a couple of things to know about partition, right? It was not inevitable. It was not a long time coming. It was a very recent set of events. And it also, for me, I think I was mentioning this in the context of it doesn't need to change necessarily the words we use when we talk about pre-modern South Asia, right? We can talk about pre-modern South Asia. It just sounds a little weird because South Asia is such a modern term, right? Whereas the word India has been used for at least 2,000 years, maybe longer, right? India is the historical term. And it goes back obviously far before British India, right? It was just India for a long time. And I think it's worth pointing out that India historically is not defined politically, right? There was no political unity. There's never like one Indian dynasty or anything like this. And I think that can be useful as well for just decentralizing political history. I do have a part in the introduction where I point out, because I know that some readers will be jarred by my use of India to mean the subcontinent, that they're never going to get over the modern nation state concept of India. And so sort of my argument to them is like, look, if it makes you uncomfortable and it makes you think every time you read India, what is this? Like, that's good. Right? Discomfort is good, and having your assumptions challenged is a good thing. That's what historians are supposed to do, right? We're not here to write, to write books that are a nice bedtime story for you all, right?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'll just ask my follow-up question, and before I forget again, just to go back to your framing, because you said that you deliberately leave the historiographical part to the introduction and do not dwell on it too much in the following chapters. And one point that you raised just now, and that is really striking, is that most of your students do not, in any case, know about these historiographical debates and do not even know about these narratives that we as historians are supposed to deconstruct. So why repeat them before deconstructing them in the first place? So how much does this have to do also with your location as a historian and as a professor of history in the United States? Do you think that the way you would have framed your book differently had you been based, for example, either in Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh, where maybe these narratives are much more prominent in the public sphere? You don't need to go to history classes to hear about all these stories of, for example, all these grand narratives that we as historians are supposed to deconstruct are very much present in the public sphere. So maybe in the Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi context, it would make more sense to start with these narratives before we deconstruct them. Yes.
Yeah, I think that is an entirely fair assessment, right? I am an American historian writing in the U.S., publishing with an American press. So yes, I was obviously thinking about that context first and foremost. That said, I would note two things. So one, I do cheat a little. Like I do have footnotes, right? Because there's certain things, like when I say something, when I write something or I phrase something a particular way, like I know some readers are just gonna go nuts. So I have a footnote sort of defending myself. So I hide it a little bit in the notes. But also, I do think, even when people know all this stuff, there is a question about, do we always have to forefront it, right? And again, I am not arguing that we should never consider colonial historiography. That would be insane. We should obviously, as historians in specialist courses, consider it all the time and have whole courses on this subject. I just wonder about, at what point, it seems to me that there's a point at which you're dealing productively with a set of ideas that's been foisted upon you, but the entire reason we want to deal with those is to get back to the Indian past, right? It's not just to address those ideas, who cares about what the colonial people thought, right? It doesn't really matter. It matters because it's hampering our access to pre-modern Indian history. And so does there come a point at which just grappling with those ideas becomes the end in itself for some people, and so we're never actually getting back to pre-modern India, right? Which was my priority here. And so I wonder if even in a South Asian context, there is space for some people to do this.
So I have two questions. One of them is that, being a historian, you have a huge moral responsibility to be able to, when you're bringing in facts and figures and you're writing history, you have a huge moral responsibility because it's going to go to the masses and it's going to shape mindsets, right? It has going to be having a huge impact. So how do you, as a historian, deal with that pressure, especially when you're writing a history book, which is going to be, part of the academic cycle? Secondly, the second question is similarly stemming to what she was also mentioning, that you were based in the US and you were writing about history of South Asia. Did you considering a lot of primary archaeological sources, since you are expert on Sanskrit and a lot of other languages, such as the Persian manuscripts of the Mughal times? There's a lot of, statues that are available, a lot of historical artifacts that are available that could have been more accessible if you were somebody in South Asia, right? Which would have been on your dispense, and that would have obviously shaped the way that you, wrote the book. So these two things. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent set of questions. So on sort of the pressure of getting it right. So I fact check obsessively. I think most historians do, but if there's anyone who doesn't, I definitely encourage you to. So I triple fact check everything by the time I actually publish, right? I fact check as I'm writing, I fact check at the end of writing a chapter, and then I do a final fact check when we get to approve the sort of proofs process with books. So that's one thing I do. I think another thing is, and I very much do this in this book, I try to signal very overtly how certain I am of a particular argument or point. Right? Because historians, we do work in degrees of certainty, especially about ancient things, right? There's some stuff that we're kind of frankly sort of guessing at, all right? And I try to be forthcoming about that. There's even parts of the book, so I'm thinking of the Indus civilization again, which is on my mind because I went to Harappa yesterday. I'll come back to that. But, so a lot of scholars have sort of claimed, they probably spoke a Dravidian language. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, right? That is pure extrapolation. Like, there were Dravidian languages spoken in South Asia at that point in history, but we don't know if they spoke it, right? So I omit that. I put it in the notes, again, because I know readers will be upset that I don't mention it. So I even cut out some things, and again, just try to signal when I'm more certain versus less certain. In terms of archaeology, so, I mean, I am fairly widely traveled. And as I mentioned, I went to Harappa yesterday because I'd never actually seen an Indus civilization city, and I wanted to see one before publishing. And I actually changed a few things in that chapter after having seen it. That said, I mean, from my perspective, and we'll see what reviewers and readers think, I think that I give a lot of airtime to material sources, including for later chapters of South Asian history. Sometimes once writing starts, like after Ashoka, people just never talk about material history again, and I do not do that. Like, I very much forefront material history in various ways throughout. We'll see if readers agree with me, because I'm also a textual person by training, so maybe it's just a lot for me. All of that said, I do think, going to places, walking around, I mean, it can help, definitely, and it can inform. But without specialist training, the value of me actually going to an archaeological site is not extensive, right? Like I said, there's a little bit of a boost there, but I would want to be clear that one cannot sort of insert travel and seeing things with one's own eyes as some sort of substitute for deep study of the wide variety of textual and material that we have. And much of that has been.
I mean, just to add to what you were saying, so not just the sites, I mean, the sources, like the primary sources, the evidence that we found, For example, we have remains, we have statues, we have pottery, we have jewelry, we have so much available in Pakistan and India and other parts of the world.
You also have handwritten manuscripts, right?
So what do you think, that could have contributed today? I know the scope of the book was very overarching, and obviously it's everything in one volume. But would that have changed the way that you would have looked at certain aspects of history? I mean, looking at primary sources of information that you would have received, or maybe gotten assistance from somebody who's an expert in archaeology in studying those objects.
No, so that's fair. I would say that I did that in the book to a great degree. The bibliography for primary sources, I think, is over 10 pages in length. So, I mean, there is quite a bit there. And I consulted with experts. I had experts in the particular periods read every single chapter as I was writing, which my colleagues were very kind to do for me. So, I mean, there is a lot there. That said, with any overview history book, it's going to be predominantly based on secondary source material. And in that sense, I'm very forthcoming about that in the introduction, right? It's one kind of historical project. It's not the only kind.
Okay, on this wonderful answer, so I think it's time to close this discussion. Thank you again to all of you, and thank you, Audrey, for presenting your upcoming book. Do you know when it should be out?
Maybe a year. We're still working on that timeline.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you again to the organizers, and we wish you a very nice evening. I think we have a music recital ahead. Thank you.